Hello, I'm Smay Ceylan and you're watching Playback. As we say hello to 2023, we'll have a look back at the most important stories that captured headlines in 2022. Well, 2022 began with a crisis in Kazakhstan. Dozens of protesters and at least 18 police officers were killed as security forces tried to contain escalating anti-government rallies. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev appealed for outside help, with Moscow answering his call. As the first Russian troops arrived in the country, the government announced it would restore vehicle fuel price caps for 6 months in an effort to appease demonstrators. But the unrest began turning into a broader movement of popular discontent. And in February, Russia launched its attack on Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin ordered the assault on the neighboring country, with missile strikes and explosions being heard across major cities. Kyiv responded with a strength and resolve that surprised many. And Western countries vowed to support Ukraine with arms and impose a series of tough sanctions to punish Russia, though they stopped short of sending their own troops. Sarah Morris reports.
As dawn was breaking, explosions rang out in several Ukrainian cities, including here in the capital, Kyiv. CCTV footage showed Russian military vehicles crossing into Ukraine from Crimea. As shelling continued, Ukrainian authorities announced there'd been more troops crossing the border from the east, north and south, including from neighbouring Belarus. This followed a televised address from Russian President Vladimir Putin announcing what he called a special military operation in the Donbass region of Ukraine.
And now some very, very important words for those who could be tempted to intervene from outside. Whoever tries to hinder us, to create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate, and it will lead to such consequences that you have never encountered in your history.
Russia claims it's only targeting military infrastructure with what it calls high-precision weapons, but civilians in their homes have also been caught up in the violence. As air raid sirens rang out across Ukraine, the government declared martial law and urged people to come forward and fight for their country.
Ukraine is defending itself and will not give up its freedom, no matter what Moscow thinks. For Ukrainians, independence and the right to live on their land according to their will is of the highest value.
The Russian operation started at the exact time UN ambassadors had convened in New York to find a last-ditch path to peace. International condemnation was swift.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
As civilian panic built in Ukraine, major traffic jams formed in Kyiv as people tried to flee the city. Those staying behind queued at banks and petrol stations, desperate to get their hands on cash and supplies. No one knows what will happen next. US President Joe Biden says he'll address the American public later on Thursday. He and his allies, including the UK, are expected to announce another round of harsh sanctions aimed at financially isolating Russia. But so far, sanctions have done nothing to deter President Putin, and some are left wondering if there's anything the international community can do to stop the bloodshed that's now expected. Sarah Morris, TRT World.
In March, those sanctions imposed on Russia caused a spike in international oil prices, and European gas costs hit record highs. That surge in energy costs and fears over future supplies prompted nations like Germany to diversify their sourcing. Sibel Karkush has more from Berlin.
Europe is prepared to suffer the consequences.
These sanctions will come at a cost for our economy too. But this is a defining moment, and this is the cost we are willing to pay.
Western leaders have long warned their own nations will suffer following sanctions on Moscow over its military attack on Ukraine. Now industries and citizens are beginning to feel it. Relying much on Russia for its oil and gas, worries about energy supplies have rattled European markets. On Wednesday, the international crude benchmark Brent hit $113 a barrel for the first time since July 2014. At the same time, European gas prices surged to a new record high of more than $200 per megawatt hour. A huge concern for Germany, which as the continent's largest economy is also the biggest consumer of Russian energy, something it's now desperate to change as its gas reserves are critically low. But they will certainly have to pay more to stay warm, as rising commodity prices have created a domino effect on costs for consumers. Last month alone, inflation in the Eurozone hit a record high of 5.8%, and analysts warn it could rise further.
Energy prices matter hugely, but also food prices more generally, because, of course, export of wheat, which comes from Russia and the Ukraine, that we've already seen wheat prices go up significantly. Plus, of course, exports of iron ore, steel, minerals that also come from Russia, and they will also be disrupted. One assumes that prices are going up there too.
So far, the US and its European allies have spared the oil and gas sector from sanctions, except for halting the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which wasn't operational, and Russia has continued to meet its supply obligations. But export restrictions and economic sanctions on Moscow are getting harsher, with the EU disconnecting key Russian banks from the SWIFT financial system on Wednesday. And with each day Russia's war in Ukraine continues, and the longer the list of sanctions gets, analysts fear high inflation could be here to stay. But for many Europeans, like these protesters here in Berlin, it's a small price to pay for Ukraine's freedom. And they say they'd rather take a cold shower than finance an unjustified war. Sibel Karkush, TRT World, Berlin.
And moving on to some other stories that made headlines over the year. French President Emmanuel Macron took home the most votes in the first round of presidential election. But no candidate won an outright majority, so he was forced to face off against his far-right rival, Marine Le Pen, in a runoff on April 24th. It was a repeat of the showdown 5 years earlier when Macron first rose to power. But as Francis Collins reports from Paris, the country's political landscape has changed drastically.
A victory party at the most stunning of Parisian backdrops. Paris in the springtime, witnessing the start of another 5 years of Emmanuel Macron as president. While not embracing everything he stood for, a nation of over 67 million people has made its choice and elected for the relative stability of the incumbent over the unpredictable nature of Marine Le Pen.
This new era will not be the continuity of the 5 years before, but the collective invention of a revised method for better years at the service of our country, of our youth.
Europe collectively will breathe again as well, knowing the person continuing to reside at the Élysée Palace is unlikely to threaten the EU or declare sympathy with Moscow and Vladimir Putin, both of which were a possibility with Le Pen. The anguish on her supporters' faces after the result came in were clear to see. She had many issues, one of them clearly highlighted by Macron in their debate, was that it's one thing being a friend of Vladimir Putin in peacetime, it's another in a moment of war.
I will pursue my commitment to France and the French people with energy, perseverance, and affection that you have known me for.
For supporters of Le Pen and Eric Zemmour in round one, there is scant consolation that France was the closest it's been to a right-wing government at any time since World War II. But it's clear the political spectrum in this country has moved to the right in recent years, and their time may yet come. For now, this is celebration time for the supporters of Macron, mixed with a little relief. And while he enjoys his victory, Macron knows he faces some challenges. He'll govern a country that appears divided politically, and the protests over the cost of living and inflation could easily reconvene. But he can't run for the highest office again and descend aside. He'll be free to enact tricky second-term policies that he believes will benefit France over the years to come.
Vive la République!
An incredible atmosphere here in Paris. The crowd delighted because the man they support, the man they wanted to return to office, has done just that. Emmanuel Macron will be back in the Elysee Palace and he'll be leading France for the next 5 years. Francis Collins, TRT World in Paris.
Well, in the U.S., a teenage gunman opened fire at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. He shot dead 19 school children and 2 teachers. It was later discovered that the shooter, Salvador Ramos, had announced his intentions beforehand on social media. The massacre once again highlighted Americans' divisions against gun laws. Our North America correspondent John Brain was in Uvalde and sent this report.
Most gracious Lord.
A depressingly familiar scene in the United States of America. A vigil for the victims of the latest mass shooting. The story always seems the same, only the location ever changes. Among those being mourned in Uvalde, Alexandria Rubio, photographed just hours before she died, smiling proudly because she'd just been named on the school's Roll of Honor. Tess Matter, who loved TikTok dance videos and baseball. And Isaiah Garcia, a 9-year-old described by his family as the sweetest little boy.
Every morning you have to open their doors for them to get out. And you see all these little faces, and I knew them.
In all, 19 children and 2 teachers were shot dead by Salvador Ramos. It's emerged the teenager's attack was premeditated. Before he embarked on his killing spree, Ramos revealed his plans on social media. Last week, on turning 18, he legally bought 2 assault rifles and 375 rounds of ammunition. The US president is desperate to reform America's gun laws, but Joe Biden knows there aren't enough of his fellow lawmakers willing to make it happen.
When in God's name will we do what needs to be done to, if not completely stop, fundamentally change the amount of the carnage that goes on in this country? To state the obvious, and Corey and a lot of other people here, I'm sick and tired. I'm just sick and tired.
Texas's Republican governor says the problem isn't firearms, but some of the people who use them.
We have a problem with mental health illness in this community. And then they elaborated on the magnitude of the mental health challenges that they are facing in the community and the need for more mental health support in this region.
This is totally predictable when you... Sir, you're out of line. Sir, you're out of line.
But his news conference descended into acrimony as his Democrat opponent, Beto O'Rourke, called for action. It's another illustration of just how divisive the issue of gun control is in this country and why any compromise seems impossible.
The conflict in Ukraine had a major breakthrough in July as a special coordination center opened in Istanbul to begin grain exports from Ukrainian ports. Under the Turkish-mediated deal, the center was staffed by Russian, Ukrainian, Turkish and UN officials. And on the battlefield, Ukrainian sources appear to be gaining momentum with a vital bridge linking Russian-occupied areas in the Kherson region closing after repeated Ukrainian missile strikes.
The opening of the coordination center is a crucial confidence-building measure. Ukrainian and Russian officials will staff it with help from Turkey and the UN.
Ships will be inspected by joint teams at appropriate locations after loading at Ukrainian ports and arriving at ports in Turkey. If there is a need for demining, we will plan it with the agreements of the parties. However, there is no need at this stage.
Later on Wednesday, Ukraine's Navy said work was continuing at 3 Black Sea ports, including Odessa, and that shipments could start soon. There are 25 million tons of grain blocked in Ukraine as a result of Russia's attack. It is desperately needed in Africa and elsewhere. The deal to export it was signed in Istanbul on July the 22nd and opens the way to convoys carrying grain to international markets through the Black Sea.
Dozens of ships have been trapped by the fighting. They could leave soon, but new ones will be needed to clear the backlog. In southern Ukraine, this bridge over the Dnipro River in the occupied Kherson region has been closed by Ukrainian shelling. Russian troops could be cut off from their supplies. It is a sign that Kiev's counterattack here is gaining momentum. US-supplied artillery is making it possible. Simon McGregor-Wood, TRT World.
Well, the United Kingdom had 3 different prime ministers between July and October. The former Conservative Party leader Boris Johnson resigned first, making room for Liz Truss. Tragically, not only after she took office, Queen Elizabeth II passed away. The monarch had spent 70 years on the throne, making her Britain's longest reigning queen. Then, just 6 days later, and 6 weeks after entering 10 Downing, Truss resigned. Rishi Sunak was then chosen to replace her by the Conservative Party. We look back at the UK's turbulent few months.
July 7th, Boris Johnson steps down after days, or more accurately 3 years, of political turmoil. After 48 hours in which more than 50 of his MPs resigned from the government, Johnson finally took the hint, announcing his resignation as Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
You could say Liz Truss was a rebound PM, preferred by the people but not the party. The relatively little-known Truss beat Finance Minister Rishi Sunak to the top job.
I'm honoured to take on this responsibility at a vital time for our country. What makes the United Kingdom great is our fundamental belief in freedom, in enterprise and in fair play. Our people have shown grit, courage and determination time and time again.
Stirring stuff, but Truss's leadership was doomed from the outset. There was the post-Brexit, post-COVID economic nightmare, compounded by Russia's war in Ukraine. But more importantly, the Queen. Just 2 days after she met and formally appointed Liz Truss as PM, Queen Elizabeth, aged 96, died. The country's longest reigning monarch was gone, prompting an outpouring of emotion from around the country and the world. Truss handled her Tony Blair moment, referring to then Prime Minister Blair's reaction to the death of Princess Diana in 1997, with suitable poise. But most were too distracted to care. Once the dust had settled and with King Charles installed, focus returned to Truss's economic policy. Her attempt to kickstart the economy by cutting taxes for high earners proved too much for a working class struggling to feed their kids. After just 44 days, she was forced out.
I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Rishi Sunak was waiting to pick up the crumbs.
I am humbled and honoured to have the support of my parliamentary colleagues and to be elected as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. It is the greatest privilege of my life to be able to serve the party I love and give back to the country I owe so much to.
Sunak became the new king's first appointment on October 25th, just 49 days after Johnson moved out of Downing Street, bringing an end to one of the UK's most profound periods of political instability. Taiba Aydin, TRT World.
And in October, violent protests erupted in Iran over the death of a young woman who was detained in police custody for improperly wearing her hijab. Demonstrators stormed the streets and remained defiant, even as the death toll rose and the government crackdown became more brutal. Sarah Bolter explains.
Iranian women cut their hair and burned their hijabs. Dramatic scenes after days of anti-government protests.
Everyone has been ignorant of all the inhumane things that have been happening to women in Iran by the Islamic government of Iran, and it needs to change. We cannot have more women die by the hands of this totalitarian regime.
Demonstrators are expressing their rage after 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in police custody. The Kurdish Iranian woman was arrested last week by the so-called morality police for improperly wearing her hijab. Authorities say her death was caused by a heart attack, but Mahsa's family says she has no history of heart problems. Protesters point to reports of medical scans showing she suffered a fatal blow to the head. Her death has triggered already simmering resentment against Tehran's policies limiting freedom in the Islamic Republic.
Women in Iran must be free, and I hope they will be liberated in Iranian society. And when women are liberated, then the whole society will be liberated.
Rights groups have expressed concern over the police crackdown, with hundreds of arrests and injuries and the use of live fire on crowds leading to several deaths. Protests have intensified and spread beyond Iran's borders to the US, Canada, Europe, and Turkey. Iranian officials say they've opened an investigation into Mahsa Amini's death. But activists warn women could be targeted even more as Iran rolls out facial recognition technology to monitor and enforce the wearing of hijabs. Sarah Balter, TRT World.
Well, it's been 2 years since a ferocious civil war broke out in Ethiopia. But in November, the government and rebels in the Tigray region said they reached a peace agreement. The African Union helped negotiate the deal, hoping to put a permanent end to the conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. But after so much bloodshed, can peace last? Our Ilyas Avcı has more.
After 2 years of conflict, Ethiopia's warring sides have agreed to peace. The cessation of hostilities comes after a series of meetings backed by the African Union.
This agreement signals a commitment to ending the use of force to settle differences and disputes, and confirms the correctness of our own country's principled policy position that political differences are best resolved through meaningful dialogue and diplomacy.
The conflict began in November 2020 when Tigray forces carried out attacks on Ethiopian National Defense Forces. The Ethiopian government responded to Tigray forces in the south, and Eritrea sided with the Ethiopian government. Together, they attacked Tigray forces in the north. The conflict is estimated to have killed tens of thousands of people and has led to a humanitarian emergency, with both sides accusing each other of war crimes. This is the first time the warring sides have engaged in normal peace talks since the conflict began.
We've just seen the announcement. We obviously will be looking into the details, but this is very much a welcome first step, which we hope can start to bring some solace to the millions of Ethiopian civilians that have really suffered during this conflict.
While the international community studies the deal, the African Union has announced an array of provisions. The hope is to restore law and order, services, and unhindered access to humanitarian supplies. But since Eritrea and other warring parties weren't involved in the agreement, it's unclear whether they'll stick to the truce. Ilyas Avcı, TRT World.
At least 5 people have been killed and several injured in the opposition-held city of Azaz in Syria. A rocket launched by PKK-YPG terrorists fell in a residential area near the border with Turkey, damaging homes. In Washington, the White House says Turkey faces a legitimate terrorist threat and has the right to defend itself. TRT World's Andy Rosejan has more.
The escalating tensions along the Turkish-Syrian border led to a chaotic scene on Tuesday. Sources in the opposition-held city of Azaz in northwest Syria say it was a rocket launched by PKK and YPG terrorists that fell in a residential area. The PKK-YPG terror group has stepped up its recent attacks. In response, the Turkish armed forces launched an offensive last weekend, Operation Claw Sword, aimed at eliminating the terror hideouts in northern Syria and northern Iraq. This is the fourth cross-border military operation Turkey has launched since 2016 in an effort to prevent a terror corridor.
From now on, there is only one point for us, which is the security of our borders and people. And no one can say anything and object to our actions. In the last couple of days, we've breathed down on the terror group's necks. I hope that very soon, with our tanks, soldiers, and our friends, we will root out all these terrorists.
And President Erdogan says Turkey could yet launch a ground operation in northern Iraq and northern Syria to eliminate the terrorist threat posed by the PKK and YPG. White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby said on Tuesday that Turkey is experiencing a legitimate terror threat on its own border and has every right to defend itself and its citizens. He went on to say that the U.S. and its partners would keep up the pressure on terrorists in Syria. U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price weighed in as well, offering condolences for the loss of life in both Turkey and Syria. Andy Rosedom, TRT World, Washington.
Well, that rounds up the 2022 review of news here on Playback. From me, Sumaya Ceylan, and the entire team, we wish you a happy new year and prosperity. Stay tuned to TRT World for more stories.